Pinecrest was the kind of town where people knew each other's dogs by name. Nestled at the edge of a thickly forested mountain range, it was the picture of calm. A place where the loudest sounds on a weekend morning came from children chasing each other in the town square, or the church bells chiming softly through the crisp air. That Saturday morning started just like any other. The sun rose gently behind the ridgeline, lighting the trees in shades of gold and orange. Locals were already out, sipping coffee on porches, jogging past the lake, and walking their dogs through the leaf-strewn paths of the Central Park. Pinecrest Farmers Market had just begun setting up when the distant hum of a helicopter disrupted the tranquility. At first, no one thought much of it. Occasionally, helicopters flew in from the ranger station or the hospital in the next town. But this one wasn't flying overhead. It was hovering loud, low, and in plain sight. Circling over the northern ridge that bordered the park, people started pointing. Phones went up. Children paused mid-play to stare. The noise grew louder as the black helicopter tilted slightly, then steadied above a narrow, rocky outcrop visible just beyond the treetops. No one knew what was happening, not yet, and then it happened. From the open side of the helicopter, a dark figure appeared. Someone screamed. Several people gasped at once. "Hey!" It was unmistakably a dog, a large one, wearing some kind of harness, being released from the aircraft. For a frozen moment, everyone thought they were watching a dog fall to its death. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others shouted for someone to do something, though no one knew what that might be. One woman dropped her coffee. A father grabbed his daughter and pulled her close. Even the dogs in the park began to bark in confusion and alarm. The figure of the dog arced through the air, limbs tucked slightly, something shiny, maybe a strap or a beacon, catching the sunlight. It disappeared just beyond the trees, out of sight. Panic spread like lightning. A few people ran toward the forest line, hoping they hadn't just witnessed something unforgivable. Others stood frozen, their faces pale, waiting for a sound. Any sign of what had just happened? Within minutes. Videos were online. Posts flooded social media. Dog thrown from helicopter in Pinecrest. What did I just see? Is insane, call someone. The footage was shaky but clear. The black helicopter. The dog dropping. The gasps in the background. People across town began texting each other, sharing links, tagging animal rescue groups and news outlets. The reaction was instant and intense. Theories began to swirl almost immediately. Some thought it was an accident, that the dog had slipped or gotten loose. Others believed it was a cruel stunt, or worse. By lunchtime, the clip had already been picked up by regional news. By evening, it was on national media platforms with headlines like "Shocking footage out of small town" and "Dog dropped from helicopter." Why? The man seen briefly inside the helicopter had already been identified. His name was Matt Ryland, and while the town was used to seeing him now and then, mostly on trails or near the ranger station, no one could understand why someone like Matt, known for working with dogs and wilderness rescues, would be involved in something so disturbing. Back at the park, people kept replaying the moment in their heads. Conversations were hushed. Parents held on to their children a little tighter. For Pinecrest, a town rarely touched by chaos, what happened that morning didn't just break the calm, it shattered it. And somewhere beyond the trees, out of sight and out of mind for now, a story much deeper than anyone could have imagined was already unfolding by mid-afternoon. Pinecrest was no longer just a quiet mountain town. It was the center of a growing firestorm. What had begun as a disturbing local event had erupted across the internet, carried on waves of shock, confusion, and moral outrage. Social media platforms were flooded with clips of the dog dropping from the helicopter. Each video came with its own caption. "This needs to be investigated immediately. Arrest him now." Why would anyone do this? Animal rights organizations were quick to respond. One group from the state capitol called it a clear case of cruelty and demanded a full criminal investigation. Others went further, calling for the man seen in the helicopter, Matt Ryland, to be banned from owning animals. By the end of the day, hashtags like hashtag justice for the dog and hashtag PINECREST drop were trending. Local news stations scrambled to catch up. Reporters descended on Pinecrest, some arriving before sunset. They set up cameras near the park where the incident had occurred, interviewing shaken witnesses and replaying the now viral footage again and again. Rumors circulated like wildfire, growing more extreme with each retelling. Someone said the dog didn't survive, a teenager told one reporter, though no one had confirmed anything. They say it hit the rocks, a man claimed while holding his phone, his voice low with anger. I heard he's been doing weird stuff in the woods for months, someone added. The more people talked, the more the story distorted. Meanwhile, Pinecrest's sheriff, a level-headed man named Daniel Whitmore, tried to keep the town calm. At a hastily arranged press conference, he confirmed that law enforcement had identified Matt Rylan as the man in the helicopter and that they had visited his residence just outside of town. But beyond that, the sheriff offered little. We're still investigating the details, he said. Mr. Ryland is cooperating, and the dog, Shadow, is alive and appears unharmed. Please be patient while we confirm the facts. That statement only deepened the confusion. If the dog had been dropped from such a height, how could it possibly be unharmed? And if the drop had been planned, what possible reason could justify such a dangerous action? The media wasn't satisfied with vague explanations. Neither were the citizens of Pinecrest. Protesters with signs gathered outside Matt's cabin by dusk. We want answers, one woman shouted into a reporter's microphone. No one with any heart would do that to an animal. Inside the cabin, Matt remained calm. He had been expecting this, didn't flinch when law enforcement had arrived earlier. He'd invited them in, shown them the equipment used during the flight, and even handed over the GPS logs from both the helicopter and Shadow's harness. He had nothing to hide, but Matt also didn't speak to the press. Every knock on his door was met with silence. His only statement had been to the sheriff. The story's bigger than that moment. You'll understand soon. That night, as the news looped endlessly on every channel, the town's mood shifted from shock to something darker, suspicion. For decades, Pinecrest had prided itself on trust, community, and shared values. Now people whispered in diners and grocery store aisles. Was Matt always this strange? Did anyone ever see how he treated the dog at home? Why didn't the sheriff arrest him right away? Meanwhile, deep in the woods beyond the ridge, noticed by the crowds and forgotten in the storm of speculation, something much more important had occurred, something that might change how the entire town saw the day's events. But for now, all anyone saw was a man they thought they knew and the shadow of something they didn't understand. To understand what happened that day in Pinecrest, the town had to look deeper, not just at the shocking images, but at the man behind them. And the man in question, Matt Rylan, was no stranger to the town, though few could say they knew him well. Matt had returned to Pinecrest 5 years earlier after serving 2 decades in the military. He wasn't the type to talk about his past, but those who paid attention knew he had worked in special operations. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone trained to face chaos and stay calm. While most of the town respected him, some admitted they found him a little too distant, a little too serious. He rarely joined community events, never posted online, and only seemed to light up when he was with his dog, Shadow. Shadow was more than a pet. He was Matt's partner, the sleek Belgian. Malinois was trained in everything from search and rescue to scent detection and off-leash wilderness navigation.
Oh.
People had seen them hiking together before dawn, practicing hand signals near the cliffs, or even performing exercises that looked like military drills. Still, no one ever imagined that bond would one day become the center of national attention. As reporters dug into Matt's background, more pieces of the puzzle came into view. After retiring from service, he had joined the Pinecrest Volunteer Rescue Unit, an unofficial, highly valued group of locals who assisted in search efforts when hikers or campers went missing in the surrounding forest. Matt brought a level of training no one else had, and his dog gave him an edge that had already proven useful more than once. He had helped find a missing child near Rockbend Lake the year before. Months later, he assisted in locating a lost hiker. During a snowstorm, tracking footprints for over 6 miles through uneven terrain. Locals who remembered those stories now hesitated, torn between gratitude and growing doubt. Could someone who had saved lives really be the same person seen dropping a dog from the sky? The sheriff's office knew they needed to act quickly before things spiraled further. He met again with Matt behind closed doors. This time, he opened up more. He explained the harness system, showed them the exact model used by elite K9 teams in rescue operations. He provided video clips of shadow training for aerial deployments, including jumps from mock platforms. Everything he did was legal and practiced. Still, law enforcement needed to be thorough. They brought in an animal control specialist and a veterinarian to examine Shadow. The report confirmed what Matt had said all along. The dog was uninjured, physically fit, and showed no signs of trauma. In fact, the vet described Shadow as alert, responsive, and extremely well cared for. Despite the evidence, the public wasn't ready to move on. They wanted answers. And so far, they had received more facts than explanations. The emotional weight of seeing a dog fall from the sky was hard to shake. Even with expert opinions saying it had been safe, what Pinecrest didn't yet know was that everything Matt had done that morning had been part of a desperate, time-sensitive operation. And the decision to deploy Shadow from the helicopter hadn't been reckless. It had been strategic, necessary. The only problem was, no one had yet connected it to what had happened the day before when 2 local teenagers failed to return. From a hike near the northern ridge for now, Matt waited in silence. Weathering the storm the only way he knew how, quietly, patiently, and without regret. Because he had seen something in the forest that morning, something the town hadn't seen yet, and he knew the truth would change everything. By the 4th day, the noise around Matt Ryland had become deafening. Reporters still camped outside his property. Drones hovered near the treetops. And news vans lined the dirt road leading to his modest cabin. Pinecrest had become the epicenter of national debate. People shouted for justice on screens, while talking heads argued on morning shows about animal ethics, training practices, and the blurry line between heroism and recklessness. But inside his cabin, Matt remained calm. He sat at his kitchen table, sipping black coffee while Shadow lay nearby. His ears perked, but his body relaxed. The dog had sensed the tension but trusted his human completely, just like he had during the jump. Just like he always had. Matt didn't flinch when protesters knocked at his gate, or when microphones were shoved through his fence slats. He didn't respond to the constant phone calls, the emails, or the endless stream of online speculation. He knew the world was only seeing a piece of the picture, a frozen moment without context, and he understood why it disturbed them. It was shocking. It was dramatic. But it wasn't wrong when Sheriff Whitmore returned for a follow-up interview. He brought someone with him, Megan Lau, a federal wilderness safety coordinator. She specialized in evaluating high-risk rescue decisions in national parks. Had reviewed Matt's documents, including the body cam footage from the helicopter, GPS logs, and Shadow's training certification. Everything checks out, she told the sheriff after they sat down in Matt's living room. The equipment used was regulation grade. The dog had safety gear. This wasn't an accident. It was a calculated deployment. Matt nodded, and it worked. Megan raised an eyebrow. That's what I'd like to understand better. What were you responding to that required something this extreme? Matt stood up and walked to a small shelf beside the door. He picked up a printed aerial image, a thermal map taken from the rescue drone that had been launched the morning of the incident. It showed a narrow ravine deep within Pinecrest Ridge. A small red dot glowed at its edge. That was picked up just after dawn, Matt said. Heat signatures, stationary, too small to be an adult. I suspected it was one of the kids. Megan asked. Matt handed her another document, the emergency bulletin issued the day before. 2 teenagers, Caleb Dawson and Leela Brenson, had gone missing during a hike. Last seen heading toward a known hazardous zone. They hadn't returned. Overnight temperatures had dropped below freezing. Time was running out. There's no way a ground team would have made it there in time, Matt explained. Too steep. Too dense. A landing would have taken hours to coordinate. Shadow was the only one who could reach them fast enough. Megan studied him for a moment. She had read his service record. She had seen how people judged him without knowing the details. But now the pieces were starting to come together. This wasn't a stunt. It wasn't careless. It was a rescue, one born of experience, precision, and urgency. "Did he find them?" she asked. Matt didn't speak. Instead, he tapped his phone and opened a file. A photo filled the screen. It showed Shadow sitting beside two shivering teenagers wrapped in emergency blankets. One was crying. 15 minutes after the drop, Matt said softly, he found them huddled at the base of the cliff. The signal he sent from his collar gave us the coordinates. They were airlifted out before noon. Megan exhaled. "You saved their lives." Matt shook his head. Shadow did. Sheriff Whitmore rubbed his chin. He knew the story would break soon. The truth was undeniable now. The town didn't know any of it yet. For them, Matt was still the man who dropped his dog from a helicopter. But all that was about to change. While the town of Pinecrest remained focused on the helicopter incident, few remembered the original emergency that had quietly shaken the community just a day before. It had started with a simple phone call to the sheriff's office. A call from a frantic mother whose teenage son, Caleb Dawson, hadn't returned from a planned hike. Caleb, along with his friend Leela Brenson, left early Friday morning for what they described as a short adventure. Both were athletic, familiar with the local trails, and known to be responsible. But when night fell, and there was still no word, panic set in. The sheriff's department launched a basic search that evening. But heavy clouds and approaching fog made it difficult to proceed. The Pinecrest Ridge Zone was one of the most dangerous sections of the nearby forest's steep terrain. Loose rock formations and sudden drops that caught even experienced hikers off guard. Getting a ground team into that part of the ridge would take hours. The plan was to resume the search at sunrise with air support and drones. That's where Matt had come in. The moment he heard about the missing teens, he volunteered. Without hesitation, he'd assisted in rescues before, but this one was different. The thermal readings taken early Saturday morning showed a faint, stationary heat signature in a place no vehicle or person could reach quickly. There was no time for indecision. Matt examined the terrain on a satellite map, compared it to his own reconnaissance data, and knew what needed to be done. It would take a helicopter, a narrow approach, and a high-risk drop. But he also knew Shadow had been trained for this, not just in theory, but in real. Rigorous drills performed in open terrain and mock rescue zones. Still, he didn't take the decision lightly. He reviewed the wind patterns, double-checked the harness straps, and confirmed the parachute deployment settings on Shadow's rig. The dog, as always, responded with complete trust. When Matt opened the chopper door and signaled the release, Shadow didn't hesitate. He jumped, steady and composed, descending into a section of forest few humans dared to enter without preparation. Matt tracked Shadow's location via satellite feed. Within minutes, the canine was moving fast, in a straight line toward the last known signal. Then he stopped. That's when the barking began. Matt heard it over the earpiece. Short, sharp bursts, the pattern they had trained for. It meant Shadow had found something. Moments later, his GPS collar sent a location pin. Rescue crews used the coordinates to guide in a second helicopter with medics and lifting equipment. When the team reached the ravine, they found Shadow curled beside the teenagers, alert and protective. Caleb had twisted his ankle during a fall. Lila had bruised her shoulder trying to help him. Both were cold, scared, and out of supplies. But they were alive. The medics later said that if Shadow hadn't found them when he did, hypothermia might have set in by nightfall. The emotional trauma alone could have caused panic or confusion in the dense terrain. Instead, they were calm, comforted by the presence of a dog who seemed to know exactly what he was doing. But none of this had been made public yet. The town was still reeling from what it believed was an act of cruelty. And while the truth was clear to those involved in the rescue, it hadn't yet reached the people demanding justice. The story wasn't over. But the moment that changed everything, the one that began with a dog leaping from a helicopter and ended with 2 lives saved, had already passed. All that remained was for the truth. To be told by the sixth day, the weight of truth finally began to tip the balance. Pinecrest's public opinion was still raw, but something had shifted. Quiet whispers replaced loud condemnation. Reporters began receiving new information from verified sources, not leaks or speculation, but actual accounts from the rescue team and official statements from the sheriff's office. The first to speak publicly was Sheriff Daniel Whitmore. He stood on the steps of the county courthouse that morning, not flanked by lawyers or aides, but by Megan Lau, the federal wilderness safety coordinator in the Dawson and Brenson families. "We understand your concern," he began, "and we understand how the events last weekend were perceived, but we're here to present the full story." He explained the facts plainly and clearly. 2 teenagers had gone missing in one of the most dangerous parts of the surrounding forest. Search efforts had been slowed by terrain and weather. A heat signature was picked up at sunrise, giving the rescue team a small window of time. Traditional access was impossible. Air support was limited, and that's where Matt Ryland came in. Mr. Ryland volunteered to lead the search using his trained canine. Shadow Whitmore continued. Based on the urgency and terrain, a decision was made to deploy Shadow using an aerial drop method. This was not a stunt. It was not an accident. It was a rescue. Carefully calculated, professionally executed, and completely legal. Paused, letting the weight of the truth settle. "Without that deployment," he said slowly, "we may not be standing here with Caleb and Lila alive today." Megan Lau then stepped forward and described the level of preparation that went into the drop. She confirmed Shadow's elite certification in aerial insertions, a rare skill, usually reserved for military and advanced rescue units. The harness system was one used by special forces. The drop zone had been mapped with precision. "This was not just an act of bravery," she said. "It was an act of mastery." Reporters scrambled to change their stories. Questions shifted from accusations to curiosity. People no longer asked, "Why would he do that?" but instead, "How did he train that dog to do it?" The footage that once caused so much outrage was being re-watched with new eyes. What once seemed horrifying now looked heroic. A dog jumping not into danger, but into action. Matt still hadn't spoken to the media, but his silence no longer felt like guilt. It felt like discipline. He had done what needed to be done, and let the results speak for themselves. At the small rescue base on the edge of town, Shadow was now something of a celebrity. The teens had come to visit him, Caleb leaning on crutches, Leela with her arm in a sling. They knelt beside him, tears in their eyes, hugging him close. Shadow, ever calm, licked their faces and wagged his tail. Matt stood back, arms crossed, quietly watching. He didn't need applause, didn't need praise. He had seen fear in those teens' eyes when they were found, and the relief that followed. That was enough. But something else happened that day. Pinecrest began to heal. The same people who had protested outside Matt's gate now brought thank you cards and gifts for Shadow. Children made drawings of helicopters and rescue dogs. Social media posts began to reflect a different tone. "We got it wrong. Turns out the dog was the hero. Sometimes we need to understand before we judge." The anger had given way to awe, and the man who had once been condemned was now being quietly recognized as something rare, not just a former soldier or a rescue volunteer, but someone who did the right thing even when the world didn't yet see it that way. By the end of the week, the narrative in Pinecrest had completely transformed. What had begun as a moment of horror had become a story of resilience, bravery, and deep trust between a man and his dog. As the full account of the rescue spread across the state, the national spotlight on Pinecrest grew brighter this time, in a much more respectful way. News stations returned, but not with confrontational questions. Now they came with curiosity, eager to learn how Shadow had been trained for such a task and what had gone into a rescue that had seemed impossible just days earlier. Matt Ryland finally agreed to speak, not to defend himself, but to highlight Shadow's role. He appeared on a local news special, seated beside Shadow in the town hall auditorium. The backdrop was simple, the Pinecrest town seal, and an American flag. He spoke plainly, without exaggeration or drama. Shadow's been with me for 6 years. He was trained for search and rescue under extreme conditions. Cliffs, snow, water, and yes, air deployment. What happened last weekend wasn't luck. It was planning, teamwork, and a little bit of faith. He explained how they had drilled the parachute jumps on simulated rigs in open fields. How Shadow had learned to stay calm during loud noises and turbulence. And how each action from jumping to barking once he found someone had been trained with precise repetition. Reporters asked him how he knew Shadow would be safe. I didn't, Matt admitted. But I knew he was the best chance those kids had. I knew he would go without hesitation if I asked him to. The audience was silent for a moment before breaking into applause. The clip of his statement went viral, not because of sensationalism, but because of its quiet sincerity. In a world often filled with over-the-top noise, Matt's calm, composed truth struck a chord. The same video that had shocked millions just days earlier now appeared beside a new one. Shadow, tail wagging, licking the face of a smiling Caleb. Dawson during his hospital visit. The Dawson and Brenson families publicly thanked Matt and Shadow, holding back tears as they recounted the fear of the unknown and the overwhelming relief that followed when they heard their children had been found alive. Lila's mother described the moment she saw her daughter being carried out of the forest, and there was the dog, walking right behind the team. I'll never forget that. Even skeptical news outlets changed their tone. Headlines now read, "The dog who leapt to save lives and from horror to heroism, what Pinecrest taught us." The sheriff's office released official commendations. Matt, though humble, accepted them only if Shadow's name appeared first. A ceremony was planned in the town square, and for the first time in weeks the atmosphere in Pinecrest was one of unity and celebration. Children wore homemade Team Shadow shirts. Local businesses displayed paw prints in their windows, and on the day of the ceremony, the entire town gathered under a clear blue sky to honor not just a rescue, but a relationship, one built on trust, training, and unspoken understanding. Matt didn't speak long at the podium. He simply knelt beside Shadow, gave him a soft pat on the neck, and said, "You saved them, buddy." The crowd rose to its feet, and in that moment, all the noise, the accusations, the doubts, the outrage faded into something else entirely. Respect. Shadow had done what few could. He had leaped into the unknown, followed his training, and saved lives. And the town that had once doubted his purpose now saw him for exactly what he was. Not just a dog. Not even just a hero, but a guardian. Silent, swift, and unwavering. The ceremony in Pinecrest Square wasn't grand or overdone. There were no flashing lights, no booming speeches, and no headlines shouted through microphones. Instead, it was quiet, sincere, and deeply human. A community coming together to say something simple but powerful. We were wrong. We're grateful. Banners that read "Thank you" Shadow lined the street. The children who had once watched the helicopter with fear now waved little paper paw flags as the town's newest. Hero walked calmly down the main road beside Matt. Shadow wore a special vest embroidered with his name and a gold badge reading, "Honorary Member, Pinecrest Rescue Unit." Matt had tried to decline the spotlight. He didn't like attention, but the town insisted not to celebrate him, but to acknowledge the truth. They had judged too quickly, let emotion cloud understanding, and almost missed seeing the full picture. This moment wasn't about erasing that mistake. It was about owning it at the podium. Mayor Green stood before a crowd larger than Pinecrest had seen in years. A week ago, we all thought we had witnessed something cruel, but what we saw was courage. What we misunderstood. As reckless was, in fact, a rescue mission of extraordinary skill, and what we assumed was a tragedy was the beginning of a story we'll never forget. She turned to Matt and Shadow. "You didn't just save 2 lives, you reminded all of us what trust, discipline, and purpose really look like." The crowd applauded, many holding back tears. Matt stepped forward, not to give a long speech, but to share a short message. "I didn't do this alone. Shadow did what he was trained to do. He leaped because he trusted me, and he succeeded because we trusted each other. That kind of bond doesn't come easy. It takes time, patience, and belief, even when things look impossible. He looked out across the crowd. I hope we can all learn to give each other that same trust, especially when we don't understand something at first glance. No one clapped immediately. Instead, there was a moment of silence, thoughtful, respectful, before the entire crowd rose in standing applause. Later that day, as the town returned to its normal rhythm, something had clearly changed. The people were more patient with one another. Conversations were softer, more open. Parents reminded their children not to jump to conclusions. And the incident that had once threatened to divide the town had instead taught them the power of second chances. As for Matt and Shadow, they went back to their routines. Early hikes, quiet afternoons, occasional training in the woods just beyond the ridge. But now, strangers often stopped them on the trail, not to question, but to say thank you. One day, a small wooden sign appeared near the trailhead where the helicopter had hovered. It wasn't placed by the government or any official organization, just a hand-carved plank nailed to a post. It read, "Shadow's Leap, where trust became a lifeline." No one took credit for it, and no one ever tried to remove it. For the town of Pinecrest, the image of a dog falling from the sky had been replaced with something deeper, the realization that sometimes the most extraordinary acts come from those we least expect, and that understanding requires more than just sight. It requires heart. Matt never sought fame, and Shadow never asked for praise. But their story became a quiet legend, passed down in schools, remembered at town events, and told every time a new child pointed to the ridge and asked, "Is that where the flying dog saved the kids?" And someone would smile and say yes. That's where a leap of faith became something unforgettable.